Growing up, Marilyn Monroe had been an ephemeral figure in my world. The American star seemed to symbolize the glamour and provocative nature of life in the limelight, in a place far removed from mine, and in a time even further removed from mine. For much of my life, I reserved mild interest, as one would for a fascinating memento from a distant past, and with a nod and a shrug, often moved on. But her image seemed always omnipresent, always arresting, always captivating. The blonde bombshell, with her silk white dress blown upwards by a passing subway train, is the very essence of beauty and fame, and to a certain extent, of American exceptionalism. For such an image could only ever have been made in America, in Hollywood, California, in a post-war world of capitalism and excess. The allure of the dumb blonde, whose childlike innocence, juxtaposed with the image of the sultry, sexy damsel, not always in distress, but perhaps, drew men wild with desire, was an image almost entirely defined by Marilyn Monroe. Like Chaplin before her, whose pale face caked in makeup, toothbrush mustache, bowler hat and suit with a cane, abstracted to its finest points. Marilyn's own visage evokes an age both alien and familiar, whimsical and sublime. And yet her untimely passing indicates something just as familiar, if perhaps not nearly as welcome. The image of the sex-pot movie star was little better than that of a whore, passed around by men to be used and discarded. And for much of her life, Monroe was often seen as such. Joyce Carol Oates' distillation of that life in her 2000 novel Blonde dares us to think beyond that, dares us to believe that there was always more to it than that there was a woman there of great talent, indeed of genius, and a passionate yearning for love, whose life deserved much more respect and compassion than that was ever afforded to her. The novel begins with her death on the 3rd of August 1962, with death itself personified by a messenger boy in a hurry, before it begins to unravel. Norma Jean Mortensen was the daughter of Gladys Mortensen, herself a once aspiring actress turned employee of the studio, whose shadow figuratively loomed over their household. Suffering from mental illness and overall unpreparedness for motherhood, Gladys has a mental breakdown and is forced to abandon Norma Jean to foster homes and orphanages after an incident which nearly kills her young daughter. For her part, Norma Jean is an innocent and naive little girl who yearns for the return of her mother, or indeed of any mother, fearing the loneliness of a life without her parents. She longed most of all for Daddy, her father whom she never met, and whose image seems entirely to have been conjured up by her mother. Yet she is a sweet girl, with a generous heart, with the nearly religious love of Hollywood films and its multitude of stars. Married at 16 to a boy several years older than her foster mother having feared her sexual maturity overwhelming her own precarious marriage, Norma Jean's life seemed to have been set. But married life was not for her, nor for her husband, whose boyish immaturity was unable to keep up with the dreamy girl, desperate for love amid the uncertainty of war. She becomes a model for magazines, meant to shore up morale in the front lines, and is soon divorced by a disapproving and resentful husband, whence she later becomes Marilyn Monroe, the blonde actress. Marilyn Monroe is a facade, a fabrication of the studio system, the very M sound of her name constructed precisely to sell an image of easy sex and unattainable beauty. Underneath is Norma Jean, that same vulnerable girl whose talent would gradually show, as she would live the lives of the characters she would portray, not merely as characters, but as people of flesh and blood. Her talent goes mostly unrecognized, and if so, often dismissed and ridiculed. The world is ruled by men after all, men whose desires needed to be satisfied, whatever they may be. She is groomed to their exacting demands, like a thoroughbred horse in a menagerie of beautiful creatures, ready to sell tickets. Her first movie audition, narrated by Norma Jean herself, describes the lurid detail of how she got her part, down on all fours, on a fur rug, as she is brutally raped by Mr. Z, the producer, surrounded by his collection of dead birds. She gets the part. She is married to the camera. She is Nell Forbes, a mentally disturbed babysitter in Don't Bother to Knock, alongside Richard Widmark, who resents his attraction to her, and how she steals the scenes. It is a common theme for much of her career, her image being solely catered to the male gaze, and yet resented for it by the very men who gaze at her. As readily as she is commodified, she is just as quickly tabooed. Her sexuality is used against her on and off screen. A tramp, a whore, would sleep with anyone who could get her further up the ladder. It is never made entirely clear if she ever really did those things, but it matters very little to those that wanted to believe what they wanted to believe. And yet slowly, she gains some control over her life. She insists on perfecting her craft, even briefly joining a theater group to improve her acting and be taken seriously. She has directors make several takes on the same scene over and over again until she feels she could do no better. She is often late or even never shows up at all, more so out of shyness, insecurity, and the addling of drugs in her system than anything else, drawing the ire of her directors, producers, the crew, and her co-stars, only for her to prove herself the greatest asset they could ever have. She draws in millions of dollars for the studio and is paid a pittance compared to her co-stars. Yet she is married to the camera and her craft. She harbors no resentment, though it angers her. She is an artist, a poet of untapped potential, shyly scribbling in her notebook the poems that laid bare her heart. She is a lover of men, and men loved her, or loved being loved by her. Her affairs transport her to euphoric ecstasies of love, unabashed by the rigid control of the studio, which seeks to capitalize on her very being. Gossip shadows and sensationalizes her life, as she is painted as a slut for questionable men, amid an era of fear of communist infiltration, the age of McCarthyism. A recurring fantasy of her life is that of the Dark Prince and the Fair Princess, taking many shapes, both beautiful and grotesque, as well as the beggar maid, who is of the other, a far less exalted figure, one who fails to become more than she is and will ever be. As her fame soars, it does her no favors. Fame overshadows her true self, which often suffused with the image of the blonde, that idealized version of American beauty. Ironically, her blonde hair, like much else about her, is another fabrication, a result of chemical dyes that sting her skin every time it is applied. In front of the camera, her genius is on display. She does not portray, she becomes. She is Rose Loomis of Niagara, the beautiful adulterous seductress who conspires to murder her husband, but is murdered in turn. She is the girl upstairs in The 7-Year Itch, the object of Tom Ewell's desires. She is Rosalind Tabor in The Misfits with Clark Gable and Montgomery Clift, a drama film written by her playwright husband, whose love for her he desperately tries to save after a near-fatal miscarriage, and from which Marilyn becomes distant and unloving. A painful abortion from years past and a lifetime of severe gynecological problems and insomnia served to worsen her dependence on drugs, often administered by seedy doctors under the pay of the studio. The Misfits would also be Clark Gable and Marilyn Monroe's last completed film before their respective deaths. Oates' prose is of a grand epic. At over 700 pages long, you get a feeling that this is more than just a fictionalized retelling of Marilyn Monroe's life, as indeed it is. Oates cautions us to read the book not as biography, but entirely as fiction. Names are changed and events pulled together to weave a larger story. Monroe is often robbed of her agency in many of the events in the story, which, while it may have happened in real life, seem to be widely amped up in this telling. I admittedly know fairly little of the real Marilyn Monroe. I've seen the documentary Love Marilyn, wherein she came across as far more aware of her image and her life than her fictional counterpart. It comes across often as a bit disjointed, as the story unfolds through radically different narratives and perspectives, flipping between separate streams of thought between characters, often in the same page. Memory mingles with fantasy, the lines blurring between the two, which I found jarring at certain points. And yet the story works precisely because it chooses not to linger with explaining events or matters of detail, but rather exploring the minds of people that would otherwise not have consented to do so in real life. It exposes a kind of truth that biography could only ever speculate at. Fiction reveals more of reality than is often cared to be admitted, driving empathy within its layers that it refuses to yield without evidence. There is a beautiful poetic sadness to this life, colored more by others, mostly men, than by the one that had to live it. The book is an indictment against the misogyny that ruled and defined American history for much of the last century. It is an indictment against the double standards set against women and their sexuality. It is also an inversion of classic fairy tale tropes, which Oates was said to have criticized as having women of low aspirations be idealized. The Dark Prince and the Fair Princess symbolize this inversion, appearing often in the guise of people whom Norma Jean seemed to recognize in her daily life. Her aspirations to become the Fair Princess is often met with disappointment and personal anguish, fame serving more as a prison than a liberation. Moreover, the book is an indictment against Hollywood fame itself, of the smoke and mirrors that peddle in fantasy, seeming to float above the earth and its discontents, despite its real-world consequences. Oddly enough, the story reminds me much of the life of Vincent van Gogh, himself an artist entirely misunderstood in his time. Like Van Gogh, Norma Jean's genius fell upon deaf ears and blind eyes, often willfully blind, out of ego and resentment against an individual that rises above their own visage. A woman of clear brilliance that exuded vitality and power through her sexuality, alluring and dangerous at the same time. A film star gluttonously devouring her scenes beyond the tolerance of her male co-stars. I was able to purchase the 20th anniversary edition of Blonde at fullybookedonline.com, the first edition having been published all the way back in 2000. It would not have gone unnoticed by those familiar with the book on how timely its reissue came, barely 3 years since the expose against Harvey Weinstein, in articles from the New York Times and the New Yorker that reported dozens of accusations against the media mogul and several other men in power. Decades of abuse through the studio system unraveled and gave birth to the Me Too movement, and the current zeitgeist that would defy the seeming monolithic patriarchal power of American exceptionalism. I thoroughly enjoyed the book and cannot recommend it enough, especially to my fellow Filipino readers. It's the first from Joyce Carol Oates' oeuvre that I've read, and hopefully not the last, although admittedly I might have bought the last ever copy from Fully Booked. Sorry about that. The novel ends where it begins, with a death, and perhaps a touch of conspiracy. Did Marilyn Monroe die of an overdose? Was she murdered in her sleep by agents of the government? The manner of her death seems to matter less than what she has left behind. A legacy of feminine strength, confidence, beauty, and artistry, which would inspire future generations of women. With it, she enters the pantheon of myth and legend. Yet Oates does not linger on this point. Rather, she presents us that same innocent girl, as vulnerable as ever, finally falling victim to the vicissitudes of fate. In a fitful dream, young Norma Jean finds herself in a movie house. On the screen, the fair princess succumbs to death as the dark prince hovers over her and fades to black. In tears, she leaves and meets her mother. Happy in each other's company amid the scent of flowers, they hurry home, and on the kitchen wall is a poster of Charlie Chaplin in City Lights. Next to it is a framed picture of a smiling man, where Gladys lifts her daughter up to see. It was Norma Jean's father. Oh, hello there. Thanks for watching my inaugural Pinoy BookTube review video. I decided on making this into more of a video essay than an impromptu vlog type review, as I realized I wanted to articulate my thoughts a bit more clearly, if less concise. Also, I have a crippling fear of being in front of the camera. Apologies for the poor audio quality. I had to record this with my gaming headset while people were watching Netflix in the other room. But I honestly don't know if I'll be keeping this format up. It takes quite a bit of time and energy, and given that I work a regular job, that'll have to come first. Nonetheless, I hope you enjoyed this video, as I have enjoyed making it. Please like, comment, and subscribe, and hopefully see you next time with another great book review.